Alright, sorry about the delay. Combination of minor technical issues and poor planning caused us to start a little late. Welcome back, therefore, to another thrilling installment of Mecha Mondays. I'm your intrepid narrator pilot Fraggeth, and today we will be reading more of Starship Troopers by one Robert Heinlein. Previously on, we got a solid dose of, oh, wait a minute. Hold on. I've been looking at the wrong chapters the entire time. Oh no. I just wasted like 10 minutes on that. Oh no. Okay, so we're not as far along in the book as I thought we were. Disregard the stream description. I have, I don't know, SBS, small brain syndrome. Jesus. Okay, that's that's mortifying. But okay, it's been a long week. Whatever. How many pages? That's how many pages is chapter 12 then? Because I might be able to cut this down. Chapter 12 is pretty beefy, but not as beefy as chapter 13. Chapter 13 is like a quarter of the book. It's wild. It's a disproportionate amount of pages. To the extent that I'm going to have to figure this one out. Okay, let's get to chapter 12, see how we're doing, because that's like that's a doozy. Okay, sorry about that. So previously on, we had our big dose of, yeah, you have to just disregard my stream description. It's just wrong. I regret to say, everything about it is wrong. My bad. I just make sure here that I'm not completely crazy. Yeah, okay, I'm not crazy. I believe this chapter is actually the one now. This chunk is going to cover a bunch of the. Oh no, there's still some philosophy in here, but there's some mechanics and logistics about how the Mobile Infantry works as a organization. As well as I think an action sequence in here. So previously on was our big dose of Starship Troopers philosophy, which covers a lot in terms of society is imploding, so because people don't spank their kids, which is a gross oversimplification of what Heinlein is presenting, but it does kind of boil down to there have to be consequences for actions. And I think that's fair. I think it does have to be made clear that there are consequences for actions, such as, I don't know, trying to defraud the American people in some way, and then, trying to use a high executive office in order to stay out of jail. I think there should be consequences for that sort of behavior, no matter who is abusing, no matter what political affiliation the person abusing power in such a way has. Anyway, just as a hypothetical, I'm glad that's never been an issue we've had to put to the test in recent memory, but here we are. Anyway, so consequences should have actions, and there will be a bit more on that. Also, the philosophy, I think, of war versus peace, which is where we get some interesting conceptual work here. And some allusions to the fact that maybe this military-run society maybe has ulterior motives. Where were we? I just got lost again. Anyway, yeah, just disregard the stream description, ultimately, because I had no idea where in the book we were, because I couldn't find the second bookmark. So I thought I couldn't find the first bookmark, sorry. So I thought the second bookmark was the starting point. And I was like, oh, we're this far along already, cool. And, and spent like 10, 15 minutes wasting my time. So that's good. Very nice. So yeah, we will get cracking with, what is this, chapter 9, I think? Yeah, starting with chapter 9 of Starship Troopers by the Heinster. Oh, good morning to you too, A Cookie. Thanks for tuning in. Chapter 9. We've got no place in this outfit for good losers. We want tough hombres who will go in there and win. Admiral Jonas Ingram, 1926. When we had done all that a mudfoot can do in flat country, we moved into some rough mountains to do still rougher things. The Canadian Rockies between Good Hope Mountain and Mount Waddington. Camp Sergeant Spooky Smith was much like Camp Curry. Oh, Camp Sergeant Spooky Smith was much like Camp Curry, aside from its rugged setting, but it was much smaller. Well, the 3rd Regiment was much smaller now, too, less than 400, whereas we had started out with more than 2,000. H Company was now organized as a single platoon, and the battalion paraded as if it were a company. But we were still called H Company, and Zim was company commander, not platoon leader. What the sweat down meant, really, was much more personal instruction. We had more corporal instructors than we had squads, and Sergeant Zim, with only 50 men on his mind instead of the 260 he had started with, kept his Argus eyes on each one of us all the time, even when he wasn't there. At least, if you goofed, it turned out he was standing right behind you. However, the chewing out you got had almost a friendly quality, in a horrid sort of way, because we had changed too, as well as the regiment. The 1 in 5 who was left was almost a soldier, and Zim seemed to be trying to make him into one, instead of running him over the hill. We saw a lot more of Captain Frankel, too. He now spent most of his time teaching us, instead of behind a desk, and he knew all of us by name and face, and seemed to have a card file in his mind of exactly what progress each man had made on every weapon, every piece of equipment, not to mention your extra duty status, medical record, and whether you had had a letter from home lately. He wasn't as severe with us as Zim was. His words were milder, and it took a really stupid stunt to take that friendly grin off his face. But don't let that fool you. There was barrel armor under the grin. I never did figure out which one was the better soldier, Zim or Captain Frankel. I mean, if you took away the insignia and thought of them both as privates. Unquestionably, they were both better soldiers than any of the other instructors. But which was the best? Zim did everything with precision and style, as if he were on parade. Captain Frankel did the same thing with dash and gusto, as if it were a game. The results were about the same, and it never turned out to be as easy as Captain Frankel made it look. We needed the abundance of instructors. Jumping a suit, as I have said, was easy on flat ground. The suit jumps just as high and just as easily in the mountains, but it makes a lot of difference when you have to jump up a vertical granite wall between 2 close-set fir trees and override your jet controls at the last instant. We had 3 major casualties in suit practice in broken country, 2 dead and 1 medical retirement. But that rock wall is even tougher without a suit, tackled with lines and pitons. I didn't really see what use Alpine drill was to a cap trooper, but I had learned to keep my mouth shut and try to learn what they had shoved at us. I learned it, and it wasn't too hard. If anybody had told me a year earlier that I could go up a solid chunk of rock as flat and as perpendicular as a blank wall of a building using only a hammer, some silly little steel pins, and a chunk of clothesline, I would have laughed in his face. I'm a sea-level type. Correction, I was a sea-level type. There had been some changes made. Just how much I had changed, I began to find out. At Camp Sergeant Spooky Smith, we had liberty. To go to town, I mean. Oh, we had liberty after the first month at Camp Curry, too. This meant that, on a Sunday afternoon, if you weren't in the duty platoon, you could check out at the orderly tent and walk just as far away from camp as you wished, bearing in mind that you had to be back for evening muster. But there was nothing within walking distance, if you don't count jackrabbits. No girls, no theaters, no dance halls, etc. Nevertheless, liberty, even at Camp Curry, was no mean privilege. Sometimes it can be very important indeed to be able to go so far away that you can't see a tent, a sergeant, nor even the ugly faces of your best friends among the boots. Not to have to be on the bounce about anything. Have time to take out your soul and look at it. You could lose that privilege in several degrees. You could be restricted to camp, or you could be restricted to your own company street, which meant that you couldn't go to the library, nor to what was misleadingly called the recreation tent. Mostly some Parcheesi sets and similar wild excitements. Or you could be under close restriction, required to stay in your tent when your presence was not required elsewhere. This last sort didn't mean much in itself, since it was usually added to extra duty so demanding that you didn't have any time in your tent other than for sleep anyhow. It was a decoration added like a cherry on top of a dish of ice cream to notify you and the world that you had pulled not some everyday goof-off, but something unbecoming of a member of the MI, and were thereby unfit to associate with other troopers until you had washed away the stain. But at Camp Spooky we could go into town, duty status, conduct status, etc. permitting. Shuttles ran to Vancouver every Sunday morning, right after divine services, which were moved up to 30 minutes after breakfast, and came back again just before supper and again just before taps. The instructors could even spend Saturday night in town, or cop a 3-day pass, duty permitting. I had no more than stepped out of the shuttle, my first pass, than I realized in part that I had changed. Johnnie didn't fit any longer. Civilian life, I mean. It all seemed amazingly complex and unbelievably untidy. I'm not running down Vancouver. It's a beautiful city in a lovely setting. The people are charming and they are used to having the MI in town, and they make a trooper welcome. There is a social center for us downtown, where they have dances for us every week, and see to it that junior hostesses are on hand to dance with, and senior hostesses to make sure that a shy boy, me, to my amazement, but you try a few months with nothing female around but lady jackrabbits, gets introduced and has a partner's feet to step on. But I didn't go to the social center that first pass. Mostly I stood around and gawked at beautiful buildings, at display windows filled with all manner of unnecessary things, and not a weapon among them, at all those people running around, or even strolling, doing exactly as they pleased, and no two of them dressed alike, and at girls. Especially at girls. I hadn't realized just how wonderful they were. Look, I've approved of girls from the first time I noticed that the difference was more than just that they dressed differently. So far as I remember, I never did go through that period boys are supposed to go through when they know that girls are different but dislike them. I've always liked girls. But that day, I realized that I had long been taking them for granted. Girls are simply wonderful. Just to stand on a corner and watch them going past is delightful. They don't walk. At least, not what we do when we walk. I don't know how to describe it, but it's much more complex and utterly delightful. They don't move just their feet. Everything moves, and in different directions, and all of it graceful. I might have been standing there yet if a policeman hadn't come by. He sized us up and said, "Howdy, boys, enjoying yourselves?" I quickly read the ribbons on his chest and was impressed. "Yes, sir." You don't have to say sir to me. Not much to do here. Why don't you go to the hospitality center?" He gave us the address, pointed the direction, and we started that way. Pat Levy, Kitten Smith, and myself. He called after us, "Have a good time, boys, and stay out of trouble," which was exactly what Sergeant Zim had said to us as we climbed into the shuttle. But we didn't go there. Pat Levy had lived in Seattle when he was a small boy and wanted to take a look at his old hometown. He had money and offered to pay our shuttle fares if we would go with him. I didn't mind, and it was all right. Shuttles ran every 20 minutes, and our passes were not restricted to Vancouver. Smith decided to go along too. Seattle wasn't so very different from Vancouver, and the girls were just as plentiful. I enjoyed it. But Seattle wasn't quite as used to having MI around in droves, and we picked a poor spot to eat dinner, one where we weren't quite so welcome. A bar-restaurant down by the docks. Now, look, we weren't drinking. Well, Kitten Smith had one beer with his dinner, but he was never anything but friendly and nice. And that is how he got his name. The first time we had hand-to-hand combat drill, Corporal Jones had said to him disgustedly, "A kitten would have hit me harder than that." The nickname stuck. We were the only uniforms in the place. Most of the other customers were merchant marine sailors. Seattle handles an awful lot of surface tonnage. I hadn't known it at the time, but merchant sailors don't like us. Part of it has to do with the fact that their guilds have tried and tried to get their trade classified as equivalent to federal service, without success. But I understand that some of it goes way back in history, centuries. There were some young fellows there, too, about our age. The right age to serve a term, only they weren't. Long-haired and sloppy and kind of dirty looking. Well, say about the way I looked, I suppose, before I joined up. Presently, we started noticing that at the table behind us, two of these young twerps and two merchant sailors, to judge by clothes, were passing remarks that were intended for us to overhear. I won't try to repeat them. We didn't say anything. Presently, when their remarks were even more personal and the laughs louder and everybody else in the place was keeping quiet and listening, Kitten whispered to me, "Let's get out of here." I caught Pat Levy's eye. He nodded. We had no score to settle. It was one of those pay-as-you-get-it places. We got up and left. They followed us out. Pat whispered to me, "Watch it." We kept on walking, didn't look back. They charged us. I gave my man a side-neck chop as I pivoted and let him fall past me, swung to help my mates. But it was over. 4 in, 4 down. Kitten had handled 2 of them, and Pat had sort of wrapped the other one around a lamppost from throwing him a little too hard. Somebody, the proprietor I guess, must have called the police as soon as we stood up to leave, since they arrived almost at once while we were still standing around wondering what to do with the meat. 2 policemen. It was that sort of a neighborhood. The senior of them wanted us to prefer charges, but none of us was willing. Zim had told us to stay out of trouble. Kitten looked blank, and about 15 years old, and said, "I guess they stumbled." "So I see," agreed the police officer, and towed a knife away from the outflung hand of my man, put it against the curb, and broke the blade. "Well, you boys had better run along, farther uptown." We left. I was glad that neither Pat nor Kitten had wanted to make anything of it. It's a mighty serious thing, a civilian assaulting a member of the armed forces, but what the deuce? The book's balanced. They jumped us, they got their lumps. All even. But it's a good thing we never go on pass armed, and have been trained to disable without killing, because every bit of it happened by reflex. I didn't believe that they would jump us until they already had, and I didn't do any thinking at all until it was over. But that's how I learned for the first time just how much I had changed. We walked back to the station and caught a shuttle to Vancouver. We started practice drops as soon as we moved to Camp Spooky, a platoon at a time, in rotation. A full platoon, that is, a company. Oh, a platoon at a time, in rotation, a full platoon, that is, a company, would shuttle down to the field north of Walla Walla, go aboard, space, make a drop, go through an exercise, and home on a beacon. A day's work. With 8 companies, that gave us not quite a drop each week, and then it gave us a little more than a drop each week as attrition continued, whereupon the drops got tougher. Over mountains, into the Arctic ice, into the Australian desert, and, before we graduated, onto the face of the moon, where your capsule is placed only 100 feet up and explodes as it ejects, and you have to look sharp and land with only your suit. No air, no parachute. And a bad landing can spill your air and kill you. Some of the attrition was from casualties, deaths, or injuries, and some of it was just from refusing to enter the capsule, which some did, and that was that. They weren't even chewed out. They were just motioned aside, and that night they were paid off. Even a man who had made several drops might get the panic and refuse, and the instructors were just gentle with him, treated him the way you do a friend who is ill and won't get well. I never quite refused to enter the capsule, but I certainly learned about the shakes. I always got them. I was scared silly every time. I still am. But you're not a cap trooper unless you drop. They tell a story, probably not true, about a cap trooper who was sightseeing in Paris. He visited Les Invalides, looked down at Napoleon's coffin, and said to a French guard there, "Who's he?" The Frenchman was properly scandalized. "Monsieur does not know that this is the tomb of Napoleon! Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest soldier who ever lived!" The cap trooper thought about it. Then he asked, "So, what were his drops?" It is almost certainly not true, because there is a big sign outside there that tells you exactly who Napoleon was. But that is how cap troopers feel about it. Eventually, we graduated. I can see that I've left out almost everything. Not a word about most of our weapons, nothing about the time that we dropped everything and fought a forest fire for 3 days, no mention of the practice alert that was a real one, only we didn't know it until it was over, nor about the day the cook tent blew away. In fact, not any mention of weather, and, believe me, weather is important to a doughboy, rain and mud especially. But though weather is important while it happens, it seems to me to be pretty dull to look back on. You can take descriptions of most any sort of weather out of an almanac and stick them in just anywhere. They'll probably fit. The regiment had started with 2,009 men. We graduated 187. Of the others, 14 were dead, 1 executed and his name struck, and the rest resigned, dropped, transferred, medical discharge, etc. Major Malloy made a short speech, we each got a certificate, we passed in review for the last time, and the regiment was disbanded, its colors to be cased until they would be needed, 3 weeks later, to tell another couple of thousand civilians that they were an outfit, not a mob. I was a trained soldier, entitled to put TP in front of my serial number instead of RP. Big day. The biggest I ever had. Chapter 10. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots. Ellipsis. Thomas Jefferson, 1787. That is, I thought I was a trained soldier until I reported to my ship.
Any law against having a wrong opinion? I see that I didn't make any mention of how the Terran Federation moved from peace to a state of emergency, and then on into war. I didn't notice it too closely myself. When I enrolled, it was peace, the normal condition, at least so many people think. Whoever expects anything else? Then, while I was at Curry, it became a state of emergency, but I still didn't notice it, as what Corporal Bronsky thought about my haircut, uniform, combat drill, and kit was much more important. And what Sergeant Zim thought about such matters was overwhelmingly important. In any case, emergency is still peace. Peace is a condition in which no civilian pays any attention to military casualties which do not achieve page 1 lead story prominence, unless that civilian is a close relative of one of the casualties. But if there ever was a time in history when peace meant that there was no fighting going on, I have been unable to find out about it. When I reported to my first outfit, Willie's Wildcats, sometimes known as Company K, 3rd Regiment, 1st MI Division, and shipped with them in the Valley Forge, with that misleading certificate in my kit, the fighting had already been going on for several years. The historians can't seem to settle whether to call this one the Third Space War, or the Fourth, or whether the First Interstellar War fits it better. We just call it the Bug War, if we call it anything, which we usually don't, and in any case the historians date the beginning of the war after the time I joined my first outship and ship. Everything up to then, and still later, were incidents, patrols, or police actions. However, you are just as dead if you buy a farm in an incident as you are if you buy it in a declared war. But, to tell the truth, a soldier doesn't notice a war much. A soldier doesn't notice a war much more than a civilian does, except his own tiny piece of it, and that just on the days it is happening. The rest of the time he is much more concerned with sack time, the vagaries of sergeants, and the chances of wheedling the cook between meals. However, when Kitten Smith and Al Jenkins and I joined them at Luna Base, each of Willie's Wildcats had made more than one combat drop. They were soldiers, and we were not. We weren't hazed for it, at least I was not, and the sergeants and corporals were amazingly easy to deal with after the calculated frightfulness of instructors. It took a little while to discover that this comparatively gentle treatment simply meant that we were nobody, hardly worth chewing out, until we had proved in a real drop, that we might possibly replace real Wildcats who had fought and bought it, and whose bunks we now occupied. Let me tell you how green I was. While the Valley Forge was still at Luna Base, I happened to come across my section leader just as he was about to hit dirt, all slicked up in dress uniform. He was wearing in his left earlobe a rather small earring, a tiny gold skull beautifully made, and under it, instead of the conventional crossed bones of the ancient Jolly Roger design, was a whole bundle of little gold bones, almost too small to see. Back home, I had always worn earrings and other jewelry when I went out on a date. I had some beautiful ear clips, rubies as big as the end of my little finger, which had belonged to my mother's grandfather. I liked jewelry, and had rather resented being required to leave it all behind when I went to basic. But here was a type of jewelry which was apparently okay to wear with uniform. My ears weren't pierced, my mother didn't approve of it, for boys, but I could have the jeweler mounted on a clip, and I still had some money left from pay call at graduation, and was anxious to spend it before it mildewed. Sergeant, where do you get earrings like that one? Pretty neat. He didn't look scornful, he didn't even smile. He just said, "You like it?" "I certainly do." The plain raw gold pointed up the gold braid and piping of the uniform even better than gems would have done. I was thinking that a pair would be still handsomer, with just crossbones instead of all that confusion at the bottom. "Does the base PX carry them?" "Nah, the PX here never sells 'em," he added. He added, "At least I don't think you'll ever be able to buy one here. I hope. But I tell you what, when we reach a place where you can buy one of your own, I'll see to it you know about it. That's a promise." Thanks. Don't mention it. I saw several of the tiny skulls thereafter, some with more bones, some with fewer. My guess had been correct. This was jewelry permitted with uniform, when on pass at least. Then I got my own chance to buy one almost immediately thereafter, and discovered that the prices were unreasonably high for such plain ornaments. It was Operation Bughouse, the first battle of Clendathu in the history books, soon after Buenos Aires was smeared. It took the loss of BA to make the groundhogs realize that anything was going on, because people who haven't been out don't really believe in other planets, not down deep where it counts. I know I hadn't, and I had been space happy since I was a pup. But BA really stirred up the civilians and inspired loud screams to bring all our forces home from everywhere, orbit them around the planet practically shoulder to shoulder, and interdict the space Terra occupies. This is silly, of course. You don't win a war by defense, but by attack. No Department of Defense ever won a war. See the histories. But it seems to be a standard civilian reaction to scream for defensive tactics as soon as they do notice a war. They then want to run the war, like a passenger trying to grab the controls away from the pilot in an emergency. However, nobody asked my opinion at the time. I was told. Quite aside from the impossibility of dragging the troops home in view of our treaty obligations and what it would do to the colony planets in the Federation and our allies, we were awfully busy doing something else, to wit, carrying the war to the bugs. I suppose I noticed the destruction of BA much less than most civilians did. We were already a couple of parsecs away under Cherenkov Drive, and the news didn't reach us until we got it from another ship that after we came out of Drive. I remember thinking, "Gosh, that's terrible," and feeling sorry for the one Porteño in the ship. But BA wasn't my home, and Terra was a long way off, and I was very busy, as the attack on Clendathu, the bugs' home planet, was mounted immediately after that, and we spent the time to rendezvous strapped in our bunks, doped and unconscious, with the internal gravity field of the Valley Forge off, to save power and give greater speed. The loss of Buenos Aires did mean a great deal to me. It changed my life enormously, but this I did not know until many months later. When it came time to drop onto Clendathu, I was assigned to PFC Dutch Bamberger as a supernumerary. He managed to conceal his pleasure at the news, and as soon as the platoon sergeant was out of earshot, he said, "Listen, Boot, you stick close behind me and stay out of my way. You go slowing me down, I break your silly neck." I just nodded. I was beginning to realize that this was not a practice drop. Then I had the shakes for a while, and then we were down. Operation Bughouse should have been called Operation Madhouse. Everything went wrong. It had been planned as an all-out move to bring the enemy to their knees, occupy their capital and the key points of their home planet, and end the war. Instead, it darn near lost the war. I am not criticizing General Dien. I don't know whether it's true that he demanded more troops and more support and allowed himself to be overruled by the Sky Marshal-in-Chief, or not. Nor was it any of my business. Furthermore, I doubt if some of the smart second-guessers know all the facts. What I do know is that the general dropped with us and commanded us on the ground, and, when the situation became impossible, he personally led the diversionary attack that allowed quite a few of us, including me, to be retrieved, and in so doing, bought his farm. He's radioactive debris on Clendathu, and it's much too late to court-martial him, so why talk about it? I do have one comment to make to any armchair strategist who has never made a drop. Yes, I agree that the Bugs planet possibly could have been plastered with H-bombs until it was surfaced with radioactive glass. But would that have won the war? The Bugs are not like us. The pseudo-arachnids aren't even like spiders. They are arthropods who happen to look like a madman's conception of a giant, intelligent spider, but their organization, psychological, and economic, is more like that of ants or termites. They are communal entities, the ultimate dictatorship of the hive. Blasting the surface of their planet would have killed soldiers and workers. It would not have killed the brain caste and the queens. I doubt if anybody can be certain that even a direct hit with a burrowing H-rocket would kill a queen. We don't know how far down they are. Nor am I anxious to find out. None of the boys who went down those holes came up again. So suppose we did ruin the productive surface of Klendathu. They still would have ships and colonies and other planets, same as we have, and their HQ is still intact. So, unless they surrender, the war isn't over. We didn't have Nova bombs at that time. We couldn't crack Klendathu open. If they absorbed the punishment and didn't surrender, the war was still on. If they can surrender. Their soldiers can't. Their workers can't fight, and you can waste a lot of time and ammo shooting up workers who wouldn't say boo, and their soldier caste can't surrender. But don't make the mistake of thinking that the bugs are just stupid insects because they look the way they do and don't know how to surrender. Their warriors are smart, skilled, and aggressive. Smarter than you are, by the only universal rule, if the bug shoots first. You can burn off one leg, 2 legs, 3 legs, and he just keeps on coming. Burn off 4 on one side and he topples over, but keeps on shooting. You have to spot the nerve case and get it, whereupon he will trot right on past you, shooting at nothing, until he crashes into a wall or something. The drop was a shambles from the start. 50 ships were in our piece of it, and they were supposed to come out of the Cherenkov drive and into reaction drive so perfectly coordinated that they could hit orbit and drop us, in formation and where we were supposed to hit, without even making one planet circuit to dress up their own formations. I suppose this is difficult. Shucks, I know it is. But when it slips, it leaves the MI holding the sack. We were lucky at that, because the Valley Forge and every Navy file inner bought it before we ever hit the ground. In that tight, fast formation, 4.7 miles per second orbital speed is not a stroll, she collided with the Ypres, and both ships were destroyed. We were lucky to get out of her tubes. Those of us who did get out, for she was still firing capsules as she was rammed. But I wasn't aware of it. I was inside my cocoon, headed for the ground. I suppose our company commander knew that the ship had been lost, and half his wildcats with it, since he was our first and would know when he suddenly lost touch, over the command circuit, with the ship's captain. But there is no way to ask him because he wasn't retrieved. All I ever had was a gradually dawning realization that things were in a mess. The next 18 hours were nightmare. I shan't tell much about it because I don't remember much, just snatches, stop-motion scenes of horror. I have never liked spiders, poisonous or otherwise. A common house spider in my bed can give me the creeps. Tarantulas are simply unthinkable, and I can't eat lobster, crab, or anything of that sort. When I got my first sight of a bug, my mind jumped right out of my skull and started to yammer. It was seconds later that I realized that I had killed it and could stop shooting. I suppose it was a worker. I doubt if I was in any shape to tackle a warrior and win. But at that, I was in better shape than was the K9 Corps. They were to be dropped, if the drop had gone perfectly, on the periphery of our entire target, and the Neo-Dogs were supposed to range outward and provide tactical intelligence to interdiction squads whose business it was to secure the periphery. Those Calebs aren't armed, of course, other than their teeth. A Neo-Dog is supposed to hear, see, and smell and tell his partner what he finds by radio. All he carries is a radio and a destruction bomb with which he, or his partner, can blow the dog up in case of bad wounds or capture. Those poor dogs didn't wait to be captured. Apparently, most of them suicided as soon as they made contact. They felt the way I do about the bugs, only worse. They have neo-dogs now that are indoctrinated from puppyhood to observe and evade without blowing their tops at the mere sight or smell of a bug. But these weren't. But that wasn't all that went wrong. Just name it. It was fouled up. I didn't know what was going on, of course. I just stuck close behind Dutch, trying to shoot or flame anything that moved, dropping a grenade down a hole whenever I saw one. Presently, I got so that I could kill a bug without wasting ammo or juice, although I did not learn to distinguish between those that were harmless and those that were not. Only about 1 in 50 is a warrior, but he makes up for the other 49. Their personal weapons aren't as heavy as ours, but they are lethal just the same. They've got a beam that will penetrate armor and slice flesh like cutting a hard-boiled egg, and they cooperate even better than we do. Because the brain is doing the heavy thinking for a squad isn't where you can, because the brain that is doing the heavy thinking for a squad isn't where you can reach it. It's down one of the holes. Dutch and I stayed lucky for quite a long time, milling around over an area about a mile square, corking up holes with bombs, killing what we found above surface, saving our jets as much as possible for emergencies. The idea was to secure the entire target and allow the reinforcements and the heavy stuff to come down without important opposition. This was not a raid, this was a battle to establish a beachhead, stand on it, hold it, and enable fresh troops and heavies to capture or pacify the entire planet. Only we didn't. Our own section was doing all right. It was in the wrong pew and out of touch with the other section. The platoon leader and sergeant were dead and we never reformed. But we had staked out a claim, our special weapons squad had set up a strong point, and we were ready to turn our real estate over to fresh troops as soon as they showed up. Only they didn't. They dropped in where we should have dropped, found unfriendly natives, and had their own troubles. We never saw them. So we stayed where we were, soaking up casualties from time to time and passing them out ourselves as opportunity offered, while we ran low on ammo and jump juice and even power to keep the suits moving. This seemed to go on for a couple of thousand years. Dutch and I were zipping along close to a wall, headed for our special weapons squad in answer to a yell for help, when the ground suddenly opened in front of Dutch, a bug popped out, and Dutch went down. I flamed the bug and tossed a grenade, and the hole closed up, then turned to see what had happened to Dutch. He was down, but he didn't look hurt. A platoon sergeant can monitor the physicals of every man in his platoon, sort out the dead from those who merely can't make it unassisted and must be picked up. But you can do the same thing manually from switches right on the belt of a man's suit. Dutch didn't answer when I called to him. His body temperature read 99 degrees. His respiration, heartbeat, and brainwave read 0, which looked bad, but maybe his suit was dead rather than he himself. Or so I told myself, forgetting that the temperature indicator would give no reading if it were the suit rather than the man. Anyhow, I grabbed the can opener wrench from my own belt and started to take him out of his suit while trying to watch all around me. Then I heard an all-hands call in my helmet that I never want to hear again. Sauve qui peut! Home! Home! Pick up and home! Any bacon you can hear! 6 minutes! All hands, save yourselves! Pick up your mates! Home on any beacon! Sauve qui... I hurried. His head came off as I tried to drag him out of his suit, so I dropped him and got out of there. On a later drop, I would have had the sense enough to salvage his ammo, but I was far too sluggy to think. I simply bounced away from there and tried to rendezvous with the strong point we had been heading for. It was already evacuated, and I felt lost. Lost and deserted. Then I heard recall. Not the recall it should have been. Yankee Doodle, if it had been a boat from the Valley Forge, but Sugar Bush, a tune I didn't know. No matter, it was a beacon. I headed for it, using the last of my jump juice lavishly. Got aboard just as they were about to button up, and shortly thereafter was in the Voortrek, in such a state of shock that I couldn't remember my serial number. I've heard it called a strategic victory, but I was there, and I claim we took a terrible licking. 6 weeks later, and feeling about 60 years older, at Fleet Base on Sanctuary, I boarded another ground boat and reported for duty to Ship Sergeant Jalal in the Roger Young. I was wearing, in my pierced left earlobe, a broken skull with one bone. Al Jenkins was with me, and was wearing one exactly like it. Kitten never made it out of the tube. The few surviving Wildcats were distributed elsewhere around the fleet. We had lost half our strength, about, in the collision between the Valley Forge and the Ypres. That disastrous mess on the ground had run our casualties up over 80%, and the powers that be decided that it was impossible to put the outfit back together with the survivors. Close it out, put the records in the archives, and wait until the scars had healed before reactivating Company K, Wildcats, with new faces but old traditions. Besides, there were a lot of empty files to fill in other outfits. Sergeant Jalal welcomed us warmly, told us that we were joining a smart outfit, best in the fleet, in a taut ship, and didn't seem to notice our ear skulls. Later that day, he took us forward to meet the lieutenant, who smiled rather shyly and gave us a fatherly little talk. I noticed that Al Jenkins wasn't wearing his gold skull. Neither was I, because I had already noticed that nobody in Rajac's Roughnecks wore the skulls. They didn't wear them because, in Rajac's Roughnecks, it didn't matter in the least how many combat drops you had made, nor which ones. You were either a roughneck or you weren't. And if you were not, they didn't care who you were. Since we had come to them not as recruits but as combat veterans, they gave us all possible benefit of doubt and made us welcome with no more than that unavoidable trace of formality anybody necessarily shows to a house guest who is not a member of the family. But, less than a week later, when we had made one combat drop with them, we were full-fledged roughnecks, members of the family, called by our first names, chewed out on occasion without any feeling on either side that we were less than blood brothers thereby, borrowed from and lent to, included in bull sessions and privileged to express our own silly opinions with complete freedom, and then have them slapped down just as freely. We even called non-coms by their first names on any but strictly duty occasions. Sergeant Jalal was always on duty, of course, unless you ran across him dirt side, in which case he was jelly, and went out of his way to behave as if his lordly rank meant nothing between roughnecks. But the lieutenant was always the lieutenant, never Mr. Rajac, not even Lieutenant Rajac. Simply the lieutenant, spoken to and of in the third person. There was no god but the lieutenant, and Sergeant Jalal was his prophet. Jelly could say "no" in his own person, and it might be subject to further argument, at least from junior sergeants, but if he said "the lieutenant wouldn't like it," he was speaking ex cathedra, and the matter was dropped permanently. Nobody ever tried to check up on whether or not the lieutenant would or would not like it. The word had been spoken. The lieutenant was father to us, and loved us and spoiled us, and was nevertheless rather remote from us aboard ship, and even dirt side, unless we reached dirt via a drop. But in a drop, well, you wouldn't think that an officer could worry about every man of a platoon spread over 100 square miles of terrain. But he can. He can. He can worry himself sick over each one of them. How he could keep track of us all I can't describe, but in the midst of a ruckus his voice would sing out over the command circuit, "Johnson, check squad 6. Smitty's in trouble." And it was better than even money that the lieutenant had noticed it before Smith's squad leader. Besides that, you knew with utter and absolute certainty that, as long as you were still alive, the lieutenant would not get into the retrieval boat without you. There have been prisoners taken in the Bug War, but none from Rajac's Roughnecks. Jelly was mother to us, and was close to us, and took care of us, and didn't spoil us at all. But he didn't report us to the lieutenant. There was never a court-martial among the Roughnecks, and no man was ever flogged. Jelly didn't even pass out extra duty very often. He had other ways of paddling us. He could look you up and down at daily inspection and simply say, "In the Navy you might look good. Why don't you transfer?" and get results, it being an article of faith among us that the Navy crew members slept in their uniforms and never washed below their collar lines. But Jelly didn't have to maintain discipline among privates because he maintained discipline among his non-coms and expected them to do likewise. My squad leader, when I first joined, was Red Green. After a couple of drops, when I knew how good it was to be a roughneck, I got to feeling gay and a bit too big for my clothes, and talked back to Red. He didn't report me to Jelly. He just took me back to the washroom and gave me a medium set of lumps, and we got to be pretty good friends. In fact, he recommended me for Lance later on. Actually, we didn't know whether the crew members slept in their clothes or not. We kept to our part of the ship, and the Navy kept to theirs, because they were made to feel unwelcome if they showed up in our country rather than on duty. Other than on duty. After all, one has social standards one must maintain, mustn't one? The lieutenant had his stateroom in male officers' country, a Navy part of the ship, but we never went there, either, except on duty, and rarely. We did go forward for guard duty, because the Roger Young was a mixed ship, female captain and pilot officers, some female Navy ratings, forward of Bulkhead 30 that was ladies' country, and 2 armed MI day and night stood guard at the one door cutting it. At battle stations, that door, like all other gas-tight doors, was secured. Nobody missed a drop. Officers were privileged to go forward of Bulkhead 30 on duty, and all officers, including the lieutenant, ate in a mixed mess just beyond it. But they didn't tarry there. They ate and got out. Maybe other corvette transports were run differently, but that was the way the Roger Young was run. Both the lieutenant and Captain Deladrier wanted a taut ship, and got it. Nevertheless, guard duty was a privilege. It was a rest to stand beside that door, arms folded, feet spread, doping off and thinking about nothing, but always warmly aware that any moment you might see a feminine creature, even though you were not privileged to speak to her other than on duty. Once I was called all the way into the skipper's office, and she spoke to me. She looked right at me and said, "Take this to the chief engineer, please." My daily shipside job, aside from cleaning, was servicing electronic equipment under the close supervision of Padre Migliaccio, the section leader of the first section, exactly as I used to work under Carl's eye. Drops didn't happen too often, and everybody worked every day. If a man didn't have any other talent, he could always scrub bulkheads. Nothing was ever quite clean enough to suit Sergeant Jalal. We followed the MI rule. Everybody fights, everybody works. Our first cook was Johnson, the second section sergeant, a big friendly boy from Georgia, the one in the Western Hemisphere, not the other one. And a very talented chef. He wheedled pretty well, too. He liked to eat between meals himself, and saw no reason why other people shouldn't. With the padre leading one section and the cook leading the other, we were well taken care of, body and soul. But suppose one of them bought it. Which one would you pick? A nice point that we never tried to settle, but could always discuss. The Roger Young kept busy, and we made a number of drops, all different. Every drop has to be different, so that they never can figure out a pattern on you. But no more pitched battles. We operated alone, patrolling, harrying, and raiding. The truth was that the Terran Federation was not then able to mount a large battle. The foul-up with Operation Bughouse had cost too many ships, way too many trained men. It was necessary to take time to heal up, train more men. In the meantime, small, fast ships, among them the Roger Young and other corvette transports, tried to be everywhere at once, keeping the enemy off balance, hurting him, and running. We suffered casualties and filled our holes when we returned to Sanctuary for more capsules. I still got the shakes every drop, but actual drops didn't happen too often, nor were we ever down long. And between times there were days and days of shipboard life among the roughnecks. It was the happiest period of my life, although I was never quite consciously aware of it. I did my full share of beefing, just as everybody else did. and enjoyed that too. We weren't really we weren't really hurt until the lieutenant bought it. I guess that was the worst time in all my life. I was already in bad shape for a personal reason. My mother had been in Buenos Aires when the bugs smeared it. I found out about it one time when we put in at Sanctuary for more capsules and some mail caught up to us. A note from my Aunt Eleonora, one that had not been coded and sent fast because she had failed to mark for that. The letter itself came. It was about 3 bitter lines. Somehow she seemed to blame me for my mother's death. Whether it was my fault because I was in the armed services and should have therefore prevented the raid, or whether she felt that my mother had made a trip to Buenos Aires because I wasn't home where I should have been, was not quite clear. She managed to imply both in the same sentence. I tore it up and tried to walk away from it. I thought that both my parents were dead, since father would never send mother on a trip that long by herself. Aunt Eleonora had not said so, but she wouldn't have mentioned father in any case. Her devotion was entirely to her sister. I was almost correct. Eventually I learned that father had planned to go with her, but something had come up and he stayed over to settle it, intending to come along the next day. But Aunt Eleonora did not tell me this. A couple of hours later the lieutenant sent for me and asked me very gently if I would like to take leave at Sanctuary while the ship went out on her next patrol. He pointed out that I had plenty of accumulated R&R and might as well use some of it. Some of it. I don't know how he knew that I had lost a member of my family, but he obviously did. I said no, thank you, sir. I preferred to wait until the outfit all took R&R together. I'm glad I did it that way, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have been along when the lieutenant bought it. And that would have been just too much to be borne. It happened very fast and just before retrieval. A man in the third squad was wounded, not badly, but he was down. The assistant section leader moved in to pick up, and bought a small piece of it himself. The lieutenant, as usual, was watching everything at once. No doubt he had checked physicals on each of them by remote, but we'll never know. What he did was to make sure that the assistant section leader was still alive, then made pickup on both of them himself, one in each arm of his suit. He threw them the last 20 feet, and they were passed into the retrieval boat. And with everybody else in, the shield gone, and no interdiction, was hit and died instantly. I haven't mentioned the names of the private and of the assistant section leader on purpose. The lieutenant was making pickup on all of us with his last breath. Maybe I was the private. It doesn't matter who he was. What did matter was that our family had had its head chopped off. The head of the family from which we took our name, the father who made us what we were. After the lieutenant had to leave us, Captain Deladrier invited Sergeant Jalal to eat forward with the other heads of departments. But he begged to be excused. Have you ever seen a widow with stern character keep her family together by behaving as if the head of the family had simply stepped out and would return at any moment? That's what Jelly did. He was just a touch more strict with us than ever, and if he ever had to say, "The lieutenant wouldn't like that," it was almost more than a man could take. Jelly didn't say it very often. He left our combat team organization almost unchanged. Instead of shifting everybody around, he moved the assistant section leader of the second section into the nominal platoon sergeant spot, leaving his section leaders where they were needed with their sections, and he moved me from lance and assistant squad leader into acting corporal as a largely ornamental assistant section leader. Then he himself behaved as if the lieutenant were merely out of sight, and that he was just passing on the lieutenant's orders, as usual. It saved us. And with that, 2/3 of the way through the book, we are now caught up to the after the first chapter. Everything from here on out, I believe, is basically future plot development, or continuing the narrative from that point in time. Chapter 11. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. W. Churchill, 20th century soldier statesman. As we came back into the ship after the raid on the Skinnies, the raid in which Dizzy Flores bought it, Sergeant Jalal's first drop as platoon leader, a ship's gunner who was tending the boat lock spoke to me. How'd it go? Routine, I answered briefly. I suppose his remark was friendly, but I was feeling very mixed up and in no mood to talk. Sad over Dizzy, glad that we had made pickup anyhow, mad that the pickup had been useless, and all of it tangled up with that washed out but happy feeling of being back in the ship again, able to muster arms and legs and note that they are all present. Besides, how can you talk about a drop to a man who has never made one? So, he answered, you guys have got it soft. Loaf 30 days, work 30 minutes. Me, I stand a watch in 3 and turn 2. Yeah, I guess so, I agreed and turned away. Some of us are born lucky. Soldier, you aren't peddling vacuum, he said to my back. And yet there was much truth in what the Navy gunner had said. We cap troopers are like aviators of the earlier mechanized wars. A long and busy military career could contain only a few hours of actual combat facing the enemy, the rest being train, get ready, go out. Then come back, clean up the mess, get ready for another one, and practice, practice, practice in between. We didn't make another drop for almost 3 weeks, and that on a different planet around another star. A bug colony. Even with Cherenkov drive, stars are far apart. In the meantime, I got my corporal's strips, nominated by Jelly and confirmed by Captain Deladrier in the absence of a commissioned officer of our own. Theoretically, the rank would not be permanent until approved against vacancy by the Fleet MI Repel Depel, but that meant nothing, as the casualty rate was such that there were always more vacancies in the TO than there were warm bodies to fill them. I was a corporal when Jelly said I was a corporal. The rest was red tape. But the gunner was not quite correct about loafing. There were 53 suits of powered armor to check, service, and repair between each drop, not to mention weapons and special equipment. Sometimes Migliaccio would down-check a suit, Jelly would confirm it, and the ship's weapons engineer, Lieutenant Farley, would decide that he couldn't cure it short of base facilities, whereupon a new suit would have to be broken out of stores and brought from cold to hot, an exacting process requiring 26 man-hours, not counting the time of the man to whom it was being fitted. We kept busy. But we had fun, too. There were always several competitions going on, from AC Doocy to Honor Squad, and we had the best jazz band in several cubic light years. Well, the only one, maybe. With Sergeant Johnson on the trumpet leading the mellow and sweet for hymns or tearing the steel right off the bulkheads, as the occasion required. After that masterful, or should it be mistressful, retrieval rendezvous without a programmed ballistic, the platoon's metalsmith, PFC Archie Campbell, made a model of the Roger Young for the skipper, and we all signed and Archie engraved our signatures on the base plate. To Hot Pilot Yvette Deladrier, with thanks from Rajac's Roughnecks. And we invited her aft to eat with us, and the roughneck downbeat combo played during dinner, and then the junior private presented it to her. She got tears and kissed him, and kissed Jelly as well, and he blushed purple. After I got my chevrons, I simply had to get things straight with Ace, because Jelly kept me on as assistant section leader. This is not good. A man ought to fill each spot on his way up. I should have had a turn as squad leader instead of being bumped from lance to assistant squad leader to corporal and assistant section leader. Jelly knew this, of course, but I know perfectly well that he was trying to keep the outfit as much as possible the way it had been when the lieutenant was alive, which meant that he left his squad leaders and section leaders unchanged. But it left me with a ticklish problem. All three of the corporals under me as squad leaders were actually senior to me. But if Sergeant Johnson bought it on the next drop, it would not only lose us a mighty fine cook, it would leave me leading the section. There mustn't be any shadow of doubt when you give an order, not in combat. I had to clear up any possible shadow before we dropped again. Ace was the problem. He was not only senior of the other three, he was not only senior of the three, he was a career corporal as well, and older than I was. If Ace accepted me, I wouldn't have any trouble with the other two squads. I hadn't really had any trouble with him aboard. After we made pickup on Flores together, he had been civil enough. On the other hand, we hadn't had anything to have trouble over. Our shipside jobs didn't put us together, except at daily muster and guard mount, which is all cut and dried. But you can feel it. He was not treating me as somebody he took orders from. So I looked him up during off hours. He was lying in his bunk, reading a book. Space Rangers Against the Galaxy. A pretty good yarn, except that I doubt if a military outfit ever had so many adventures and so few goof-offs. The ship had a good library. Ace, got to see you. He glanced up. So, I just left the ship. I'm off duty. I've got to see you now. Put your book down. What's so aching urgent? I've got to finish this chapter. Oh, come off it, Ace. If you can't wait, I'll tell you how it comes out. You do, and I'll clobber you. But he put the book down, sat up, and listened. I said, Ace, it's about this matter of the section organization. You're senior to me. You ought to be assistant section leader. Ah, so it's that again. Yep. I think you and I ought to go see Johnson and get him to fix it up with Jelly. You do, eh? Yes, I do. That's how it's got to be. So? Look, Shorty, let me put you straight. I got nothing against you at all. Matter of fact, you were on the bounce that day we had to pick up Dizzy. I'll hand you that. But if you want a squad, you go dig up one of your own. Don't go eyeing mine. Why, my boys wouldn't even peel potatoes for you. That's your final word? That's my first, last, and only word. I sighed. I thought that it would be, but I had to make sure. Well, that settles that. But I've got one thing on my mind. I happen to notice that the washroom needs cleaning, and I think maybe you and I ought to attend to it. So put your book aside. As Jelly says, non-coms are always on duty. He didn't stir at once. He said quietly, You really think it's necessary, Shorty? As I said, I got nothing against you. Looks like. Think you can do it? I can sure try. Okay, let's take care of it. We went aft to the washroom, chased out a private who was about to take a shower he didn't really need, and locked the door. Ace said, You got any restrictions in mind, Shorty? Well, I hadn't planned to kill you. Check. And no broken bones, nothing that would keep either of us out of the next drop. Except maybe by accident, of course. That suit you? Suits, I agreed. I think maybe I'll take my shirt off. Wouldn't want to get blood on your shirt. He relaxed. I started to peel it off, and he let go a kick for my kneecap. No wind-up. Flat-footed and not tense. Only my kneecap wasn't there. I had learned. A real fight ordinarily can last only a second or two, because that is all the time it takes to kill a man, or knock him out, or disable him to the point where he can't fight. But we had agreed to avoid inflicting permanent damage. This changes things. We were both young, in top condition, highly trained, and used to absorbing punishment. Ace was bigger. I was maybe a touch faster. Under such conditions, the miserable business simply has to go on until one or the other is too beaten down to continue, unless a fluke settles it sooner. But neither of us was allowing any flukes. We were professionals and wary. So it did go on, for a long, tedious, painful time. Details would be trivial and pointless. Besides, I had no time to take notes. A long time later, I was lying on my back and Ace was flipping water in my face. He looked at me, then hauled me to my feet, shoved me against a bulkhead, steadied me. "Hit me!" "Huh?" I was dazed and seeing double. "Johnny, hit me!" His face was floating in the air in front of me. I zeroed in on it and slugged it with all the force in my body, hard enough to mash any mosquito in poor health. His eyes closed, and he slumped to the deck, and I had to grab at a stanchion to keep from following him. He got slowly up. "Okay, Johnny," he said, shaking his head. "I've had my lesson. You won't have any more lip out of me, nor out of anybody in the section. Okay?" I nodded, and my head hurt. "Shake?" he asked. We shook on it, and that hurt too. Almost anybody else knew more about how the war was going than we did, even though we were in it. This was the period, of course, after the bugs had located our home planet, through the skinnies, and had raided it, destroying Buenos Aires and turning contact troubles into all-out war, but before we had built up our forces and before the skinnies had changed sides and become our co-belligerents and de facto allies. Partly effective interdiction for Terra had been set up from Luna. We didn't know it, but speaking broadly, the Terran Federation was losing the war. We didn't know that either. Nor did we know that strenuous efforts were being made to subvert the alliance against us and bring the skinnies over to our side. The nearest we came to being told about that was when we got instructions, before the raid in which Flores was killed, to go easy on the skinnies, destroy as much property as possible, but to kill inhabitants only when unavoidable. What a man doesn't know, he can't spill if he is captured. Neither drugs, nor torture, nor brainwash, nor endless lack of sleep can squeeze out a secret he doesn't possess. So we were told only what we had to know for tactical purposes. In the past, armies have been known to fold up and quit because the men didn't know what they were fighting for, or why, and therefore lacked the will to fight. But the MI does not have that weakness. Each one of us was a volunteer to begin with, each for some reason or other, some good, some bad. But now we fought because we were MI. We were professionals with esprit de corps. We were Rajak's Roughnecks, the best unprintable outfit in the whole expurgated MI. We climbed into our capsules because Jelly told us it was time to do so, and we fought when we got down there because that is what Rajak's Roughnecks do. We certainly didn't know that we were losing. Those bugs lay eggs. They not only lay them, they hold them in reserve, hatch them as needed. If we killed a warrior, or 1,000 or 10,000, his or their replacements were hatched and on duty almost before we could get back to base. You can imagine, if you like, some bug supervisor of population flashing a phone to somewhere down inside and saying, "Joe, warm up 10,000 warriors and have 'em ready by Wednesday. And tell engineering to activate reserve incubators N, O, P, Q, and R. The demand is picking up." I don't say they did exactly that, but those were the results. But don't make the mistake of thinking that they acted purely from instinct, like termites or ants. Their actions were as intelligent as ours. Stupid races don't build spaceships. And were much better coordinated. It takes a minimum of a year to train a private to fight and to mesh his fighting with his mates. A bug warrior is hatched able to do this. Every time we killed 1,000 bugs at a cost of 1 MI, it was a net victory for the bugs. We were learning, expensively, just how efficient a total communism can be when used by a people actually adapted to it by evolution. The bug commissars didn't care any more about expending soldiers than we cared about expending ammo. Perhaps we could have figured this out about the bugs by noting the grief the Chinese hegemony gave the Russo-Anglo-American alliance. However, the trouble with lessons from history, however, the trouble, oh my God. There we go. However, the trouble with lessons from history is that we usually read them best after falling flat on our chins. But we were learning. Technical instructions and tactical doctrine orders resulted from every brush with them, spread through the fleet. We learned to tell the workers from the warriors. If you had time, you could tell from the shape of the carapace, but the quick rule of thumb was, if he comes at you, he's a warrior. If he runs, you can turn your back on him. We learned not to waste ammo even on warriors except in self-protection. Instead, we went after their lairs. Find a hole, drop down it first a gas bomb which explodes gently a few seconds later, releasing an oily liquid which evaporates as a nerve gas tailored to bugs. It is harmless to us, and which is heavier than air and keeps on going down. Then you use a second grenade of HE to seal the hole. We still didn't know whether we were getting deep enough to kill the queens, but we did know that the bugs didn't like these tactics. Our intelligence through the skinnies and on back into the bugs themselves was definite on this point. Besides, we cleaned their colony off Sheol completely this way. Maybe they managed to evacuate the queens and the brains, but at least we were learning to hurt them. But so far as the Roughnecks were concerned, these gas bombings were simply another drill, to be done according to orders, by the numbers, and on the bounce. Eventually, we had to go back to Sanctuary for more capsules. Capsules are expendable. Well, so were we. And when they are gone, you must return to base, even if the Cherenkov generators could still take you twice around the galaxy. Shortly before this, a dispatch came through breveting Jelly to Lieutenant, Vice Rejak. Jelly tried to keep it quiet, but Captain Deladrier published it and then required him to eat forward with the other officers. He still spent all the rest of his time aft. But we had taken several drops by then, with him as platoon leader, and the outfit had gotten used to getting along without the lieutenant. It still hurt, but it was routine now. After Jalal was commissioned, the word was slowly passed around among ourselves and chewed over that it was time for us to name ourselves for our boss, as with other outfits. Johnson was senior and took the word to Jelly. He picked me to go along with him as moral support. "Yeah?" growled Jelly. Sarge, Lieutenant, we've been thinking." "With what?" "Well, the boys have been sort of talking it over, and they think, they say the outfit ought to call itself Jelly's Jaguars." "They do, eh? How many of 'em favor that name?" "It's unanimous," Johnson said simply. "So, 52 ayes, and 1 no. The noes have it." Nobody ever brought up the subject again. Shortly after that, we orbited at Sanctuary. I was glad to be there, as the ship's internal pseudo-gravity field had been off for most of 2 days before that, while the chief engineer tinkered with it, leaving us in free fall, which I hate. I'll never be a real spaceman. Dirt underfoot felt good. The entire platoon went on 10 days rest and recreation and transferred to accommodation barracks at the base. I have never learned the coordinates of Sanctuary, nor the name or catalog number of the star it orbits. Because what you don't know, you can't spill. The location is ultra top secret, known only to ship's captains, piloting officers, and such. And, I understand, which each of them under orders and hypnotic compulsion to suicide if necessary to avoid capture. So I don't want to know. With a possibility that Luna Base might be taken and Terra herself occupied, the Federation kept as much of its beef as possible at Sanctuary, so that a disaster back home would not necessarily mean capitulation. But I can tell you what sort of a planet it is. Like Earth, but retarded. Literally retarded, like a kid who takes 10 years to learn to wave bye-bye and never does manage to master patty cake. It is a planet as near like Earth as two planets can be, same age according to the planetologists, and its star is the same age as the Sun and the same type, so say the astrophysicists. It has plenty of flora and fauna, the same atmosphere as Earth, near enough, and much the same weather. It even has a good-sized moon and Earth's exceptional tides. With all these advantages, it barely got away from the starting gate. You see, it's short on mutations. It does not enjoy Earth's high level of natural radiation. Its typical and most highly developed plant life is a very primitive giant fern. Its top animal life is a proto-insect which hasn't even developed colonies. I am not speaking of transplanted Terran flora and fauna. Our stuff moves in and brushes the native stuff aside. With its evolutionary progress held down almost to zero by lack of radiation and a consequent most unhealthily low mutation rate, native life forms on Sanctuary just haven't had a decent chance to evolve and aren't fit to compete. Their gene patterns remain fixed for a relatively long time. They aren't adaptable, like being forced to play the same bridge hand over and over and over again for eons, with no hope of getting a better one. As long as they just competed with each other, this didn't matter too much. Morons among morons, so to speak. But when types that had evolved on a planet and enjoying high radiation and fierce competition were introduced, the native stuff was outclassed. Now, all the above is perfectly obvious from high school biology. But the high forehead from the research station there who was telling me about this brought up a point I would never have thought of. What about the human beings who have colonized Sanctuary? Not transients like me, but the colonists who live there, many of whom were born there, and whose descendants will live there, even unto the umpteenth generation. What about those descendants? It doesn't do a person any harm not to be radiated. In fact, it's a bit safer. Leukemia and some types of cancer are almost unknown there. Besides that, the economic situation is at present all in their favor. When they plant a field of Terran wheat, they don't even have to clear out the weeds. Terran wheat displaces anything native. But the descendants of those colonists won't evolve. Not much, anyhow. This chap told me that they could improve a little through mutation from other causes, from new blood added by immigration, and from natural selection among the gene patterns they already own. But that is all very minor compared with the evolutionary rate on Terra and on any usual planet. So, what happens? Do they stay frozen at their present level while the rest of the human race moves on past them until they are living fossils, as out of place as a pithecanthropus out in a spaceship? Pithecanthropus. Pithecanthropus. Or will they worry about the fate of their descendants and dose themselves regularly with X-rays, or maybe set off lots of dirty type nuclear explosions each year to build up a fallout reservoir in their atmosphere, accepting, of course, the immediate dangers of radiation to themselves in order to provide proper genetic heritage of mutation for the benefit of their descendants? This bloke predicted that they would not do anything. He claims that the human race is too individualistic, too self-centered, to worry that much about future generations. He says that the genetic impoverishment of distant generations through lack of radiation is something most people are simply incapable of worrying about. And of course, it is a far distant threat. Evolution works so slowly, even on Terra, that the development of a new species is a matter of many, many thousands of years. I don't know. Shucks, I don't know what I myself will do more than half the time. How can I predict what a colony of strangers will do? But I'm sure of this. Sanctuary is going to be fully settled, either by us or by the bugs. Or by somebody. It is a potential utopia, and, with desirable real estate so scarce in this end of the galaxy, it will not be left in the possession of primitive life forms that failed to make the grade. Already it is a delightful place, better in many ways for a few days R&R than is most of Terra. In the second place, while it has an awful lot of civilians, more than 1 million, as civilians go, they aren't bad. They know there is a war on. Fully half of them are employed either at the base or in war industry. The rest raise food and sell it to the fleet. You might say that they have a vested interest in war, but, whatever their reasons, they respect the uniform and don't resent the wearers thereof. Quite the contrary. If an MI walks into a shop there, the proprietor calls him "Sir," and really seems to mean it, even while he's trying to sell something worthless at too high a price. But in the first place, half of those civilians are female. You have to have been out on a long patrol to appreciate this properly. You need to have looked forward to your day of guard duty for the privilege of standing 2 hours out of each 6 with your spine against bulkhead 30. And your ears cocked for just the sound of a female voice. I suppose it's actually easier in the all-stag ships, but I'll take the Roger Young. It's good to know that the ultimate reason you are fighting actually exists, and that they are not just a figment of the imagination. Besides the civilian wonderful 50%, about 40% of the Federal Service people on Sanctuary are female. Add it all up, and you've got the most beautiful scenery in the explored universe. Besides these unsurpassed natural advantages, a great deal has been done artificially to keep R&R from being wasted. Most of the civilians seem to hold 2 jobs. They've got circles under their eyes from staying up all night to make a serviceman's leave pleasant. Churchill Road from base to city is lined both sides with enterprises intended to separate painlessly a man from money he really hasn't any use for anyhow, to the pleasant accompaniment of refreshment, entertainment, and music. If you are able to get past these traps, through having already been bled of all valuta, there are still other places in the city almost as satisfactory. I mean, there are girls there, too, which are provided free by a grateful populace. Much like the social center in Vancouver, these are, but even more welcome. Sanctuary, and especially Espiritu Santo, the city, stuck with me as such an ideal place that I toyed with the notion of asking for my discharge there when my term was up. After all, I didn't really care whether my descendants, if any, 25,000 years hence, had long green tendrils like everybody else, or just the equipment I had been forced to get by with. That professor type from the research station couldn't frighten me with that no radiation scare talk. It seemed to me, from what I could see around me, that the human race had reached its ultimate peak anyhow. No doubt a gentleman warthog feels the same way about a lady warthog. But, if so, both of us are very sincere. There are other opportunities for recreation there, too. I remember with particular pleasure one evening when a table of roughnecks got into a friendly discussion with a group of Navy men, not from the Roger Young, seated at the next table. The debate was spirited, a bit noisy, and some base police came in and broke it up with stun guns just as we were warming to our rebuttal. Nothing came of it, except that we had to pay for the furniture. The base commandant takes the position that a man on R&R should be allowed a little freedom as long as he doesn't pick one of the 31 crash landings. The accommodation barracks are all right too. Not fancy, but comfortable, and the chow line works 25 hours a day with civilians doing all the work. No reveille, no taps, you're actually on leave, and you don't have to go to the barracks at all. I did, however, as it seemed downright preposterous to spend money on hotels when there was a clean, soft sack free, and so many better ways to spend accumulated pay. That extra hour in each day was nice too, as it meant 9 hours solid, and the day still untouched. I caught up sack time clear back to Operation Bughouse. It might as well have been a hotel. Ace and I had a room all to ourselves in visiting non-com quarters. One morning, when R&R was regrettably drawing to a close, I was just turning over about local noon when Ace shook my bed. "On the bounce, soldier! The bugs are attacking!" I told him what to do with the bugs. "Let's hit dirt," he persisted. "No dinero." I had had a date the night before with a chemist, female of course, and charmingly so, from the research station. She had known Carl on Pluto, and Carl had written me to look her up, if I ever got to Sanctuary. She was a slender redhead with expensive tastes. Apparently, Carl had intimated to her that I had more money than was good for me, for she decided that the night before was just the time for her to get acquainted with the local champagne. I didn't let Carl down by admitting that all I had was a trooper's honorarium. I bought it for her while I drank what they said was, but wasn't, fresh pineapple squash. The result was that I had to walk home afterwards. The cabs aren't free. Still, it had been worth it. After all, what is money? I'm speaking of bug money, of course.
No ache, Ace answered. I could juice you. I got lucky last night. Ran into a Navy file who didn't know percentages.
So I got up and shaved and showered, and we hit the chow line for half a dozen shell eggs and sundries, such as potatoes and ham and hot cakes and so forth, and then we hit dirt to get something to eat. The walk up Churchill Road was hot, and Ace decided to stop in a cantina. I went along to see if their pineapple squash was real. It wasn't, but it was cold. Can't have everything. We talked about this and that, and Ace ordered another round. I tried their strawberry squash. Same deal. Ace stared into his glass, then said,
Ever thought about greasing for officer?
I said, Huh? Are you crazy?
Nope. Look, Johnny, this war may run on quite a piece. No matter what propaganda they put out for the folks at home, you and I know that the bugs aren't ready to quit. So why don't you plan ahead? As the man says, if you've got to play in the band, it's better to wave the stick than to carry the big drum.
I was startled by the turn the talk had taken, especially from Ace. How about you? Are you planning to buck for a commission?
Me? He answered. Check your circuits, son. You're getting wrong answers. I've got no education, and I'm 10 years older than you are. But you've got enough education to hit selection exams for OCS, and you've got the IQ they like. I guarantee that if you go career, you'll make sergeant before I do, and get picked for OCS the day after.
Now I know you're crazy.
You listen to your pop. I hate to tell you this, but you are just stupid and eager and sincere. You are just stupid and eager and sincere enough to make the kind of officer that men love to follow into some silly predicament. But me, well, I'm a natural non-com with the proper pessimistic attitude to offset the enthusiasm of the likes of you. Someday I'll make sergeant, and presently I'll have my 20 years in and retire to get one of the reserve jobs. Cop, maybe, and marry a nice fat wife with the same low tastes I have, and I'll follow the sports and fish and go pleasantly to pieces.
Ace stopped to wet his whistle. Don't mind if I do.
But you, he went on, you'll stay in and probably make high rank and die gloriously, and I'll read about it and say proudly, I knew him when. Why, I used to lend him money. We were corporals together. Well?
I've never thought about it, I said slowly. I just meant to serve my term. He grinned sourly.
You see any term enrollees being paid off today? You expect to make it on 2 years?
He had a point. As long as the war continued, a term didn't end, at least not for cap troopers. It was mostly a difference in attitude, at least for the present. Those of us on term could at least feel like short-timers. We could talk about when this flea-bitten war is over. A career man didn't say that. He wasn't going anywhere, short of retirement. Or buying it. On the other hand, neither were we. But if you went career and then didn't finish 20, well, they could be pretty sticky about your franchise even though they wouldn't keep a man who didn't want to stay. Maybe not a 2-year term, I admitted, but the war won't last forever.
It won't?
How can it?
Blessed if I know. They don't tell me these things. But I know that's not what is troubling you, Johnny. You got a girl waiting?
No. Well, I had, I answered slowly, but she dear John'd me. As a lie, this was no more than a mild decoration, which I tucked in because Ace seemed to expect it. Carmen wasn't my girl, and she never waited for anybody. But she did address letters with Dear Johnny on the infrequent occasions when she wrote to me. Ace nodded wisely.
They'll do it every time. They'd rather marry civilians and have somebody around to chew out when they feel like it. Never you mind, son. You'll find plenty of 'em more than willing to marry you when you're retired. And you'll be better able to handle one at that age. Marriage is a young man's disaster and an old man's comfort.
He looked at my glass.
It nauseates me to see you drinking that slop.
I feel the same way about the stuff you drink, I told him. He shrugged.
As I say, it takes all kinds. You think it over.
I will. Ace got into a card game shortly after. He lent me some money and I went for a walk. I needed to think. Go career? Quite aside from that noise about a commission, did I want to go career? Why, I had gone through all this to get my franchise, hadn't I? And if I went career, I was just as far away from the privilege of voting as if I had never enrolled. Because as long as you were still in uniform, you weren't entitled to vote. Which was the way it should be, of course. Why, if they let the roughnecks vote, the idiots might vote not to make a drop. Can't have that. Nevertheless, I had signed up in order to win a vote. Or had I? Had I ever cared about voting? No, it was the prestige, the pride, the status of being a citizen. Or was it? I couldn't, to save my life, remember why I had signed up. Anyhow, it wasn't the process of voting that made a citizen. The lieutenant had been a citizen in the truest sense of the word, even though he had not lived long enough to ever cast a ballot. He had voted every time he made a drop. And so had I. I could hear Colonel Dubois in my mind. Citizenship is an attitude, a state of mind, an emotional conviction that the whole is greater than the part, and that the part should be humbly proud to sacrifice itself that the whole may live. I still didn't know whether I yearned to place my one and only body between my loved home and the war's desolation. I still got the shakes every drop, and that desolation could be pretty desolate. But nevertheless, I knew at last what Colonel Dubois had been talking about. The MI was mine, and I was theirs. If that was what the MI did to break the monotony, then that was what I did. Patriotism was a bit esoteric for me, too large scale to see. But the MI was my gang. I belonged. They were all the family I had left. They were the brothers I had never had, closer than Carl had ever been. If I left them, I'd be lost. So why shouldn't I go career? All right. But how about this nonsense of greasing for a commission? That was something else again. I could see myself putting in 20 years and then taking it easy, the way Ace had described, with ribbons on my chest and carpet slippers on my feet. Or evenings down at the Veterans Hall, rehashing old times with others who belonged. But OCS? I could hear Al Jenkins in one of the bull sessions we had about such things.
I'm a private. I'm going to stay a private. When you're a private, they don't expect anything of you. Who wants to be an officer or even a sergeant? You're breathing the same air, aren't you? Eating the same food, going the same places, making the same drops, but no worries.
Al had a point. What had chevrons ever gotten me, aside from lumps? Nevertheless, I knew I would take sergeant if it was ever offered to me. You don't refuse. A cap trooper doesn't refuse anything. He steps up and takes a swing at it. Commission, too, I supposed. Not that it would happen. Who was I to think that I could ever be what Lieutenant Rajak had been? My walk had taken me close to the candidates' school, though I don't believe I intended to come that way. A company of cadets were out on their parade ground, drilling at trot, looking for all the world like boots in basic. The sun was hot, and it looked not nearly as comfortable as a bull session in the drop room of the Roger Young. Why, I hadn't marched farther than Bulkhead 30 since I had finished basic. That breaking in nonsense was past. I watched them a bit, sweating through their uniforms. I heard them being chewed out. By sergeants, too. Old home week. Old Home Week. I shook my head and walked away from there. Went back to the accommodation barracks, over to the BOQ wing, found Jelly's room. He was in it, his feet up on a table and reading a magazine. I knocked on the frame of the door. He looked up and growled, "Yeah?" "Sarge, Lieutenant, spit it out." "Sir, I want to go career." He dropped his feet to the desk. "Put up your right hand." He swore me, reached into the drawer of the table, and pulled out papers. He had my papers already made out, waiting for me, ready to sign. And I hadn't even told Ace. How about that? And that is where we will call it for this week. Probably, yeah, 2 more sections, I would think. This was chunk part 4, so we'll have 5 and 6. So yeah, we got the initial Klendathu drop and how much of a complete disaster that was, even though he skips over a lot of it. Because he isn't involved in all of it. He's got his chunk of ground, and that's what they did. We get a bit more philosophy. We get a few other things. We get life in the MI.
Life in the Mobile Infantry.
So good times all around. Alrighty. So next week we'll continue doing that. It will be the next chapter in a chunk of the second to last. The final chapter is like 2 pages long, so I don't even count it. I barely count it. It's more of an epilogue than anything. So we'll cut in a bit to chapter 13, which is a huge chunk of the book. Substantial. A lot happens. And yeah, that'll do it. So to anyone tuning in for the first time, hi. I do this every week, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at about 12 noon Eastern Time, or UTC -5. Mondays are Mecha Mondays. Right now we're reading through Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. Wednesdays are kind of a float day. They're wordy Wednesdays at the moment, and we're going to be doing double duty with it to do short stories pulled from the short story collection by Greg Egan entitled Instantiation on Fridays as well, until we are done with it. And then Fridays will be trading off between the Destination Void series by Frank Herbert and later Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom, and the Three Body Problem by Cixin Liu. So that'll be fun. Looking forward to that. That should be in 2-3 weeks. I should get started on that. Hopefully we'll be able to bang out all of Destination Void before I am gone away for 2 weeks, and we'll go from there. That's the first 2 weeks of August are going to be dicey for me schedule-wise, but we will make it happen outside of that time frame. So yeah, hopefully people enjoyed. I know I certainly did. Anybody who wants to get caught up on anything I've done previously, it's all on the YouTube channel, which should be linked in the stream description. I now have things now organized up until this stream. So they are all now in their proper playlists. Probably, and I generally do it at the end of every month or beginning of the new month. This month I went a week beyond where I would have liked, so whatever. So we'll do the same thing at the end of the month. By then, Starship Troopers should be over and done with, so that'll be full and complete. Yeah. Okay, with that I'm gonna scooch. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. See you all later. Thanks again for tuning in. Bye.